It began on a night soaked in fog, a night the world would never know. Charleston, 1831. The streets silent except for the whisper of Spanish moss brushing cobblestones. Two women, worlds apart in power and color, labored within the walls of a mansion that could swallow continents whole. One, a French countess whose beauty and poise could command the attention of kings. The other, her personal slave, Celeste, whose sharp intelligence was a secret weapon concealed beneath the mask of obedience. Within hours, both gave birth. By dawn, the children had vanished. Not lost, swapped, replaced. A deadly pact had been set in motion, invisible to all but those who orchestrated it. This was no mere act of desperation, it was a carefully calculated maneuver, born from fear, desire, and a ruthless understanding of how power could be manipulated. Countess Margot Devillefort knew that the truth of her child's parentage would shatter her social standing. Celeste, in turn, understood that exposure meant losing the only child she would ever know. In that shadowed moment, they exchanged futures as casually as one might trade letters. And in doing so, they ignited a chain reaction of deception that would echo for decades, touching judges, merchants, plantation owners, and politicians alike. The mansion itself seemed complicit, its Georgian facade watching silently over the harbor, as if it had seen such betrayals before. Within its walls, forged documents would be drafted, murders quietly orchestrated, inheritances rewritten, and truths buried in layers of lies. Charleston's elite, blinded by privilege and obsession with appearances, never questioned the subtleties, never saw the cracks forming in the foundations of their world. By the time whispers of doubt surfaced decades later, the network of secrets had grown too vast, too intricate, to be unraveled without catastrophe. And catastrophe came, but not immediately. 34 years of silent manipulation, careful erasures, and strategic alliances would pass before the first domino fell. When it did, it destroyed a dynasty built on cotton, blood, and the illusion of stability. The American dream of legacy, wealth, and honor became a cautionary tale, hidden in private letters, court records, and memories no one dared to speak aloud. This is the story of the night that changed everything, the night when a countess and her slave decided who would inherit power, who would be erased, and who would become a pawn in a game the world was never meant to witness. It is a story of secrets, of control, of the lengths humans will go to protect themselves, and the darkness that lives quietly in the spaces between right and wrong. Inside the Peton mansion, every glance, every whispered word carried weight. Countess Margot, elegant, poised, and endlessly calculating, moved like a predator in silk, aware of the invisible strings that bound her. Celeste, outwardly compliant, concealed a mind sharper than any sword, capable of reading intentions before they were spoken. Between them, a silent understanding existed, a pact forged not out of friendship, but out of necessity. The mansion was their arena, and each action, each gesture, each smile was a chess move. Colonel Harrison Peton, the master of the estate, was oblivious to the full scope of what he had sown. He believed he controlled the narrative of his family, the lineage of his fortune. But his nocturnal indiscretions, whispered about only in corridors of servants' quarters, had seeded a vulnerability no wealth could guard. Celeste's pregnancy, born of these secret encounters, would intersect with the Countess's own unborn child in a way that not even the colonel could predict. The very bloodlines he considered his own were now instruments in a silent war of deception. The Countess consulted frequently with Dr. Jean-Baptiste Rousseau, a fellow French exile whose reputation for discretion was as vital as his medical skill. To the outside world, he treated Margot for delicate European ailments. In truth, he was an accomplice, a strategist in the shadows, observing, advising, and facilitating the interchange of fates. The doctor's presence was a signal, a subtle nod that this mansion was a place where normal rules did not apply, where the law of survival, secrecy, and ambition reigned supreme. Outside, Charleston thrived on appearances. Wealthy planters and city dignitaries attended soirees and dinner parties, unaware that within these walls, legacies were being rewritten in silence. The streets, lined with horse-drawn carriages and European goods, hid a dark undercurrent. The exploitation of the powerless, the manipulation of trust, and the meticulous erasure of inconvenient truths. To walk these streets was to breathe in both beauty and corruption. The city itself became a stage, and every resident an unwitting actor in a drama of secrecy that could destroy them if they ever glimpsed the full picture. And the children, the swapped infants, remained at the heart of it all. To everyone outside the mansion, they were innocents, symbols of legacy and hope. But to those who orchestrated the swap, they were pawns, their lives preordained by decisions no one outside these walls could imagine. Each laugh, each first step, each whispered word carried the weight of deception. Their futures were being written in the shadows, a silent story of identity, privilege, and power that no one was meant to uncover. Every moment within the mansion reinforced a truth few ever confront. Control is never a gift, it is a weapon. And in 1831 Charleston, that weapon was wielded expertly by those who understood its true cost, the price of legacy, of silence, and of survival. Winter of 1831 arrived like a shadow falling across the lowcountry, chilling both the body and the spirit. Within the Peton mansion, the air felt heavy, thick with anticipation and dread. The pregnancies were reaching their peaks, each day bringing the Countess and Celeste closer to their irreversible choices. Margot walked the gardens with deliberate elegance, speaking in soft French to Celeste, her voice laced with urgency that no servant could interpret. Behind her polite smile and amber eyes lay the sharp calculations of a woman who understood that a single misstep could obliterate her life and the lives of those she manipulated. Celeste, confined to the small cottage on the mansion grounds, moved with the quiet dignity of someone who had long since learned to survive beneath the weight of oppression. Yet in those private moments, she allowed herself brief flashes of defiance, glances toward the mansion, careful measurements of the Countess's moods, the silent acknowledgement of the dangerous knowledge they both now shared. Both women were bound by an unspoken rule. The moment the children were born, the world as they knew it would fracture. They were no longer merely participants in life. They had become architects of destiny, capable of rewriting lineage, privilege, and history itself. The colonel remained unaware of the full extent of the tension, though he sensed it in subtle, unnerving ways. He spent long hours in his study, reviewing plantation accounts, inspecting his lands, consulting lawyers, never noticing the small but deliberate movements of the two women whose lives intersected so dangerously with his own. Yet, every act he thought he controlled, every inheritance, every public announcement was already shifting beneath his hands. The clock was ticking, and with every heartbeat, the mansion itself seemed to lean closer to the secrets it had been harboring for decades. Dr. Rousseau's visits intensified, his presence both comforting and threatening, a reminder that the Countess's plans were not without witnesses. In hushed French, they discussed contingencies, outcomes, and the fragile structures of truth that could crumble at the slightest revelation. Each strategy was precise, bordering on surgical, for they knew that mistakes here would not merely cause scandal, they would provoke destruction. Families would fall, reputations would die, fortunes would vanish, and the very fabric of Charleston's elite society could unravel, leaving only chaos behind. By the time the first cries pierced the night, the swap had already been imagined, rehearsed in meticulous detail. What the world saw as two births, a natural event, was in reality the ignition of a carefully orchestrated deception. In that instant, identity, inheritance, and the illusions of power were no longer reliable. They had become tools in a silent war. Every touch, every glance, every whispered instruction carried the weight of a conspiracy that would endure for decades, shaping lives without mercy, without conscience. The mansion was alive with tension, and in that tension, a terrible clarity emerged. Sometimes the most dangerous legacies are not those written in law, but those written in secrecy, in silence, and in the hearts of those who dare to play with destiny itself. The night of the births arrived like a storm that no one outside the mansion could perceive. Inside, the atmosphere was electric with silent calculations. The midwives, unaware of the conspiracies swirling around them, moved between rooms, candles flickering, shadows dancing across the walls. Countess Margot and Celeste labored in separate chambers, each guided by instinct, fear, and the awareness that the fate of generations depended on the next few hours. When the infants finally cried, the sound was not innocent, it was the prelude to a deliberate rewriting of history. The swap was executed with precision. The Countess's child, born of ambition and a father hidden by propriety, was quietly removed, replaced with the child of Celeste and Colonel Peton. One child would inherit wealth, prestige, and a life designed by the elite. The other would grow in secrecy, nurtured in shadows, their identity a secret kept even from themselves. The women who orchestrated this knew they were defying nature, morality, and law, but necessity demanded it. To expose the truth would invite ruin, public disgrace, and, in Celeste's case, a brutal severing from her child. The mansion became a theater of careful deception, where every glance and every word afterward would be an exercise in performance. Outside, Charleston continued in blissful ignorance. Merchants unloaded European luxuries on the docks. The streets echoed with horse-drawn carriages, and the elite attended dinner parties, oblivious to the subtle manipulations occurring in their midst. In this world, appearances were more powerful than reality. A single family secret, if revealed, could destabilize the delicate network of wealth, influence, and social hierarchy. And that night, that secret was born not in whispers, but in action. From this moment forward, the children themselves were weapons, though innocent. One was a shield for Margot, the other a lever for Celeste. Each would grow unaware of the roles assigned to them, their lives shaped by deception long before they could comprehend the choices made on their behalf. Documents were forged, midwives sworn to silence, and servants indoctrinated into complicity. Every detail was orchestrated to prevent discovery for decades. Yet even in that careful orchestration, human fragility lingered. Small errors, unnoticed gestures, and fleeting expressions would later become clues, threads that, when pulled, could unravel everything. And pull they would. The mansion, with its Georgian grandeur and harbor-facing windows, became not a home but a crucible of secrecy, where ambition, fear, and power intertwined to create a pattern that could not be erased. This was the genesis of destruction, the night when two infants were exchanged, and an entire dynasty's fate was quietly, irreversibly altered. In the shadows, the first whispers of corruption, deceit, and calculated manipulation began to gather like a storm, preparing to sweep through decades of lives untouched, yet profoundly changed. The decades that followed were a masterclass in subtlety and control. The mansion, its walls steeped in whispers, became a fortress of deception. Countess Margot maintained her poise, her outward elegance masking the constant tension beneath. Celeste moved among the servants and the elite alike, her intelligence cloaked beneath obedience, ensuring no thread of truth unraveled. Each day, each interaction, each casual remark was measured, curated, and designed to reinforce the illusion. The swapped children grew, oblivious to the labyrinthine network of lies surrounding them, carrying the weight of destinies they had never chosen. Strategic marriages, carefully worded letters, forged legal documents all became weapons in a war fought not with armies, but with information. The mansion was both theater and armory, where wealth, power, and influence were wielded like sharpened blades. Any misstep could expose decades of careful planning. Yet Margot and Celeste thrived in this tension, knowing that mastery over perception was more powerful than mastery over force. Their children, unknowingly, were the final instruments in this ongoing orchestration. Meanwhile, the social elite of Charleston remained blind, addicted to appearances, incapable of perceiving the currents of manipulation flowing beneath their gilded world. Politicians, judges, and plantation owners were all ensnared, their trust exploited, their reputations subtly redirected. A single forged signature could redirect millions. A single discreetly placed rumor could destroy alliances. This was not chaos, it was absolute control. And control, once established, became its own religion. By mid-century, whispers began. Certain members of the household began noticing inconsistencies, letters that disappeared, subtle contradictions in inheritance, a pattern too deliberate to be coincidence. But suspicion alone could not pierce the armor of secrecy. The mansion and its agents had prepared for this. Those who looked too closely were silenced quietly. An unexplained accident, a convenient death, a disappearance that the world quickly forgot. The strategy was flawless because it relied not on intimidation alone, but on conditioning, teaching those around them that the truth was dangerous, that silence was survival. This is the first point where you, listening now, must choose to engage. Comment below the phrase "the shadow knows," and then type it again to mark your awareness of hidden systems and your alignment with the truths few dare to confront. It is not mere ritual. It is a conscious act, a mental lock, a signal that you are no longer passive in the face of deception. This phrase anchors your understanding, binds it to action, and awakens a perception that, once opened, cannot be closed. Through this deliberate orchestration, the mansion and its women created a microcosm of power that mirrored the broader forces controlling the South. Control over birth, over knowledge, over perception, these were the weapons. And those who did not recognize it were already complicit in their own manipulation. By the 1850s, the web of deception began to fray. The mansion, once impenetrable in its meticulous orchestration, started leaking fragments of truth, subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to unsettle those attuned to anomalies. The children, now adolescents, displayed behaviors and talents that hinted at hidden lineage. Observant servants, visiting acquaintances, and even members of Charleston's elite began noticing contradictions that could no longer be ignored. In the shadows, the quiet pulse of panic began to beat beneath the Countess's composed exterior. Margot, ever the strategist, intensified her control. Documents were re-examined, letters rewritten, and alibis reinforced with surgical precision. Celeste, too, sharpened her vigilance, understanding that the slightest slip could trigger exposure. The mansion had become a crucible of human calculation, a place where every movement, every conversation, and every gesture carried potential consequence. The stakes were no longer private. They had begun to bleed into the wider society, threatening the fragile hierarchy upon which Charleston's elite relied. Small accidents began surfacing. A sudden illness of a key household member, a fire that conveniently destroyed partial records, an inheritance contested but quietly settled out of court. Each event was orchestrated, each outcome precisely tailored to maintain the illusion of control. And yet, no matter how carefully executed, tension mounted. Secrets of this magnitude, once in motion, possess their own momentum. The more one fights to contain them, the faster they begin to consume everything in their orbit. The mansion became a psychological battlefield. Fear was as potent a tool as wealth. The adults who knew too much were manipulated through subtle coercion, emotional blackmail, veiled threats, strategic isolation. Children were unknowingly trained to act within the framework of deception, conditioned to accept the world as carefully scripted. Power, here, was not enforced with swords or guns, it was wielded in the mind, in the perception of reality itself. And as the first cracks appeared in the household's meticulously constructed reality, the surrounding society remained oblivious. Politicians, judges, and merchants continued their routines, blind to the slow erosion of truth around them. Yet, by 1860, a single spark, a letter misfiled, a remark overheard was all that was needed to ignite a chain reaction. History, carefully rewritten, was poised to confront reality, and the price would be catastrophic. The lesson of this mansion, this deadly pact, and the decades of manipulation is clear: power is never given. It is seized, constructed, defended, and, most importantly, hidden. The moment secrecy falters, the carefully balanced world collapses, leaving only ruin, revelation, and the ghosts of those who once controlled destiny from the shadows. By 1865, the first domino fell, subtle yet irreversible. A letter, misfiled or perhaps deliberately misplaced, surfaced in the possession of a junior clerk in a Charleston law office. Its contents were innocuous at first glance, a reference to inheritance, a child's parentage, but to those who understood, it was a key that unlocked decades of deception. The mansion, once a fortress of secrecy, became a cage of truth. Margot and Celeste realized the inevitability of exposure, the suffocating weight of consequences that no careful planning could now mitigate. Society began to notice cracks. Wealthy neighbors whispered about inconsistencies in family claims, distant relatives questioned sudden changes in fortune, and a pattern emerged that linked multiple families across the city. What had been invisible, carefully hidden behind polite smiles and extravagant displays of wealth, was now visible to anyone willing to see. The legal system, manipulated for decades through forged documents and strategic alliances, struggled to respond. Judges who once accepted the house's authority without question found themselves ensnared in evidence they could not ignore. The mansion itself, a symbol of elegance and control, became a stage for confrontation. Arguments erupted, servants testified, and the children grown into young adults learned the truth of their identities in fragmented, devastating pieces. The weight of deception was no longer abstract. It was personal, psychological, and corrosive. Lives carefully built on secrecy began to crumble under the clarity of revelation. Friends became enemies, alliances fractured, and the elite's obsession with appearances offered no shield against the truth. And yet, the most destructive forces were not social or financial, they were psychological. The generations raised under manipulation now faced the realization that their identities, their rights, and even their sense of self had been engineered by the ambitions and fears of others. The Countess and Celeste, architects of the deception, witnessed the very system they controlled unraveling, powerless to prevent the chaos they had long contained. It was a lesson in hubris, a demonstration that even the most meticulous control is fragile against time, chance, and human error. By the time the dust settled, the Peton dynasty had been destroyed. Fortune, influence, and reputation had evaporated, leaving only fragmented legacies and whispered accounts of what had occurred. Yet beyond the destruction of one family lay a darker truth. The same patterns, deception, identity manipulation, and calculated control were replicated across the antebellum South. The Peton mansion was not unique. It was a template, a mirror reflecting the hidden corruption embedded within wealth and power. Those who survived the exposure emerged changed. And those who study these events, decades or centuries later, are forced to confront an uncomfortable reality. Power is fragile, deception is enduring, and the human cost of hidden agendas is incalculable. The deadly pact of 1831 was more than a personal betrayal, it was a lesson in control, secrecy, and the consequences of playing God with lives. In 1923, the final act came like a silent reckoning. A fire consumed the mansion's records, letters, and documents, the tangible proof of decades of deception. Flames licked the Georgian walls, devouring evidence of identity swaps, forged wills, and orchestrated murders. For the outside world, it was a tragic accident, a loss of old Charleston architecture. For those who knew the truth, it was an obliteration of certainty, a deliberate erasure of history that ensured the deadly pact would linger in shadow, whispered only in fragments, half-remembered letters, and rumor. The fire did more than destroy paper. It shattered the possibility of legal or historical redress. Generations of descendants were left to inherit a legacy without clarity, identities without context, and fortunes whose origins were stained by invisible corruption. Those who had survived the original swap, Margot, Celeste, and the children, were long gone, but their influence endured, a spectral imprint of control, manipulation, and hidden knowledge. The mansion itself, reduced to ruins, became a monument not to grandeur, but to the fragility of power built on lies. Historians piecing together the story decades later found only fragments. Cryptic letters, references in court notes, and whispered accounts from descendants who remembered more than they admitted. From these pieces emerges a disturbing pattern. The structures of society, wealth, and authority are not immune to corruption. They are shaped by those who understand the hidden levers of human behavior: fear, desire, secrecy, and loyalty, and who wield them with surgical precision. The deadly pact of 1831 was not an anomaly. It was a demonstration of how power can be manipulated invisibly, how legacies can be stolen, and how history can be rewritten without a trace. What this teaches us today is stark and unflinching. The people we trust, the institutions we revere, and the systems that claim to uphold justice are vulnerable to subtle, unseen influence. Secrets carried in silence can alter the course of lives, families, and entire societies. And the more carefully they are hidden, the more destructive their eventual revelation. Those who understand this are not merely observers, they are participants in a world where knowledge is power, and ignorance is the weapon of the controlled. So remember, the mansion, the swap, the fire, they are not just stories. They are warnings. The past is never dead. It whispers in the shadows, waiting for someone willing to see the structures of control, to understand how easily human lives can be manipulated, and to recognize the fragile line between survival and devastation. Those who walk this path of knowledge cannot return to innocence. Once you see the machinery of power and deceit, you carry its truth forever, and with it, the responsibility to navigate the world with eyes unclouded by illusion. Comment: The shadow knows twice to seal your awareness of hidden truths. Like and subscribe if you want more forbidden histories that reveal what the powerful tried to erase. Share this story with someone who thinks they understand the history of America but don't tell them everything yet.